Okay, so welcome. I'm so happy to see so many of you here. It reminds me of lecture, though. Everyone is sitting in the back. It's great to have you here. I'm Mark Hill. I'm the chair of the Computer Community Consortium, or CCC, which is the organization that is doing this event. I'm partially excited to see all of you here because had I had such an event when I was in your situation, I would have found it really valuable. And we're going to do our best to try to make this valuable to you. I'm going to start with a slight infomercial on what the CCC is. And so the idea here is to catalyze the virtuous cycle that information technology can do for the country and the world. And this is a cycle that involves citizens, government, academia, and industry. And all these forces sort of normally communicate with each other, but often those channels can be bilateral and they can be low bandwidth and they can not be intentional. So what the CCC tries to do is to get these various groups to talk to each other. This picture is not to scale because we're only 24 people, but the idea is to get a much higher bandwidth and get people in the same room. And so I hope, and we're going to talk about what we do, but one of the things we do is workshops, and you will probably be invited to some workshops over the years, and please go because it's a good chance to mix with other people, to expand your ideas, and to contribute because people at different stages in their career have very different perspectives, and they're all good. And so we get this, hopefully this virtuous cycle on our best days. And so the way this works is that, well, first of all, our mission is we're part of the Computer Research Association, and I'll introduce Sue Davison pretty soon to talk about our parent organization, the CRA. And our mission of the CCC is to catalyze computing research and enable the pursuit of innovative, high-impact research. And so we are 24 council members, mostly professors, some from industry. There's a staff, which really makes things happen, and there's a chair, who's myself, Vice Chair Beth Minot, who was having thunderstorm issues, so she may not, I'm sorry, Vice Chair Liz Bradley, and past Chair Beth Minot is not here yet, I don't think, and she's landing shortly, and Director Ann Drobness, and I get Liz, raise your hand as well, she's the Vice Chair. And what we do is we run workshops, blue sky tracks, we encourage white papers, we do reports out to, especially to government. Some of what we do influences thinking, some of what we do influences funding. And we also want to do human development across the career spectrum. This is a perfect example of doing human development early in the process. Obviously, if you become a member of the council, you get to develop. And then Peter Harsha, who's going to actually talk tomorrow, helps run a leadership in government thing so that you can figure out ways to contribute and, maybe go work for a year at the State Department, which some of our members have done. Okay, so the agenda here is that this is career mentoring, there's 3 parallel sessions, then there's visioning, and then working in DC and having impact. Is there more that you wanted me to say about this, Ann, than just go over it? Okay. All right. She's the boss, really. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is introduce Sue Davidson. She is the current chair of the Computer Research Association, which is our parent organization. She's an expert in databases and bioinformatics at the University of Pennsylvania, and because of this, she's been chair of the computer science department and has an appointment in the Department of Genetics. So, Sue.
Thanks, Mark. Unlike Mark, I'm not as prepared, but I would like to welcome you. It's really exciting to see so many of you here today at this very exciting workshop. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the CRA, or Computing Research Association. We're a board of about 30 people, most of whom are members who are elected from the community. Those members include both academic departments as well as industry. Industry is very important to keep connections to. We also have representatives from professional societies like ACM and IEEE. So you can think of CRA as really a connector between various organizations and groups that are interested in seeing research in computer science promoted. Some examples of what we do. Well, CCC is, of course, one of our proud subcommittees. And what they are doing is really helping with the connection to government through visioning and other types of exercises through this workshop, which is also very important and exciting. As Mark mentioned, we also run a workshop on leadership and government. It's affectionately called LISPE. So you might want to keep that in your sights for some future point in your career, perhaps not right now. We also provide information about departments, which we gather by your department chairs who dutifully assign somebody to fill this information out. Gather information about how many people are at each rank, salaries, and a bunch of other information that's very useful in planning the growth of your department. We also have a big focus on women and minorities. How many people here have heard about CRAW? Okay, that's wonderful. I think the CRAW is one of our, in addition to CCC, one of our proudest subcommittees because they're extraordinarily active and they are providing a lot of resources to departments to help with improving the number of women and minorities in the department. And then we also do a bunch of information. We have blog postings and a newsletter. We're also very well known, and some of you may have used us for the job postings. How many used us for the job postings? Okay, so that's another thing that we're fairly known for. So CRA, our mission is, of course, to promote computer science research in all of these different ways. It's an exciting organization to be associated with, so at a future point in your career, not now, I really encourage you to think about getting more involved, perhaps thinking about running for the board at a future point in time. But for now, please sit back and enjoy what we can help you with, and if there's anything how we can help you as younger researchers in the field, please let us know. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sue. Let's see, I was reminded of a couple important logistics that I was supposed to announce. How many of you have been CI fellows? Okay, so that's another thing that we were able to do a few years ago, which when there was that big downturn, is to help provide a bridge that you guys can still be in academia. So we're very proud of that, and this is in some sense the culmination of that program with the last few quarters that were left over. All right, so it's now my privilege to introduce Dean Greg Morissette. Get him to blanch at that. So Greg is a longtime professor at Cornell University. He got his PhD at Carnegie Mellon. He's the dean of the School of Computing and Information Sciences. His research area is programming languages, but with a particular emphasis on building secure, reliable, and high-performance systems. He has sort of millions of awards that may be in your future, such as Fellow of the ACM. And he served on a whole bunch of boards. I'm particularly jealous about this Max Planck Institute, because I figured that gives you lots of trips to Europe, but and then usual boards like SIZE and things like that. And so with that, Greg.
Thanks, Mark.
And by the way, I should emphasize, I'm in hardware and we make things faster, and notice that we're 3 minutes ahead of schedule.
Well, I'm sure I can fix that. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm very honored and a little intimidated to talk with you this morning. Fortunately, somebody this morning reminded me that we all have this imposter syndrome, and I need to buck up, and it'll be okay. But I wanted to talk to you about what I think you have, which is the best job in the whole world. And sometimes I feel like we need to remind ourselves just how fortunate we are to be researchers, and especially researchers in a field that is so dynamic, so exciting, where all the resources are going to, and we should appreciate that. So, part of the reason it's a great job is you get to work with incredibly smart people. If you look around this room, the aggregate IQ is just off scale. And getting to know and work with smart people is one of the joys of life. Another thing that I always thought was remarkable was that people would actually pay me to do research. I mean, it's fun to do research. Why would you pay me to do that? That's awesome. And then when you get into teaching and advising, you find out that's incredibly fulfilling. The first time a student comes back and says, "You changed my life. The classroom that I had with you really changed my life." This just really moves you deeply to your core. Also, we have flexibility that people, especially people in academia, don't have elsewhere. So, for example, you're able to go launch a startup, and in fact, often universities encourage young faculty to go do a startup. You're also able to engage with multiple companies. In my own research, it's been extremely useful to talk to many different companies as opposed to just one about, for example, security problems that they all face in the aggregate. And sometimes you get to be the convener who brings together different companies. So that's very exciting. And then the opportunity to engage with and influence government. You saw the virtuous cycle that Mark was putting up is another aspect of what's exciting about this job, is that especially in our field, where both the economic prosperity of the nation is dependent upon this field, but also the number of societal problems that we are causing is huge. We need to be at the forefront and leading that. That means we need to engage with government, and we have the opportunity to do so as researchers. So these are some of the reasons why I think you have a fantastic job, and we should celebrate this. And every time you wake up in the morning and you think, "Oh my gosh, my life is hard," you should remind yourself what a great job it is. Okay. Having said that, it can be a little stressful. Half your job is really doing research. I'm thinking, by the way, I really pitched this at academics, and I apologize to anybody in industry or elsewhere, but that's really what I know. And as an academic, half your job is research, half your job is teaching, right? Half your job is fundraising, half your job is service. Oh yeah, and then there's small things like your family. So there's never enough time in the day. You're always working on so many different things, and in part it's because this job is so exciting and so flexible. Okay, so for this talk, what I wanted to do was to try to demystify a few things and offer some bits of advice from my standpoint, although you should take it all with a giant grain of salt, right? I hope that the other senior colleagues around here will call me out when I say something stupid or they disagree with me, or you do, because, advice is, well, advice. And then hopefully I can answer a few questions here at the end, or at least inspire you to ask some questions that collectively we can try to answer. Okay, so a little bit about my story. I'm just lucky, okay? At the end of the day, I am the luckiest guy in the world. The only thing I will say is that some luck can be made. So your career isn't dependent upon being lucky. It's dependent upon making as much luck as you possibly can. Just for a little bit of background, I went to school at a small liberal arts college down in Virginia, University of Richmond. They had a computer science department, which at the time was kind of rare for liberal arts schools, and so that's part of the reason I picked it. I got involved with research. I was really lucky right away, but this was back when computer science classrooms had 10 students in them instead of hundreds that we have today. So it was pretty easy to get involved with research. That experience allowed me to get into a really top program at Carnegie Mellon, And probably the most important thing in my life happened while there. I got married to Tanya, and if you've ever met Tanya, she's a nutcase, but man, she is really the reason that I'm able to stand up here and talk with you today. Right after grad school, I landed a job, luckily, at Cornell. So my thesis wasn't even done when I interviewed there. I hadn't actually even built the compiler that I claimed I was going to build when I gave my job talk. And so most of the schools that I interviewed at, respectfully shook my hand, patted me on the head, said, yeah, that's nice, go ahead. But somehow Cornell took a risk on me. So that's when I talk about luck, that's another example of luck that I had. While there at Cornell, that was the formative part of my career, and really had some great mentoring and some great advice and a great environment to sort of grow up in as a researcher. Just as importantly, we had both our kids early on, right after graduate school. And part of that is my wife was bored in Ithaca, so she just decided we were going to have kids, and that was that. And I'm very happy about that, although today I'm particularly sad because John, the youngest, is going off to college now. So that time goes by really, really, really fast. I spent a sabbatical year at Microsoft in Cambridge, England. And then while I was there, the dean of the School of Engineering at Harvard called me up and asked me to come by and visit. And so I did. I gave a talk. And the next thing I knew, I had an offer from Harvard. I was, again, incredibly lucky. I didn't even know I was applying. I wasn't applying, right? So I joined the Harvard faculty. I left Cornell and regretfully, but went to the Harvard faculty, had a great time there. I got a chance to step into some leadership roles as the director for a center called the Center for Research on Computation and Society. And that center was really focused on bringing together people all over campus from the social sciences, from the humanities, but also from medicine and law and business to address issues that are sort of central to society but involve computation. And that was great. It really got me connected to a much broader world than just the computer science realm. And then through a series of unfortunate events, and this is usually how leadership happens in academia. It's not so much that you step forward as all your colleagues take 2 steps back and you're left standing there. So that's exactly what happened. I ended up slotting into a position as the Associate Dean for Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Harvard. Those were incredibly hard years. That was essentially the time when I was a department chair at Harvard. Incredibly hard because I felt an enormous responsibility to the other faculty. And I'll talk a little bit about that going on. A few years ago, but I enjoyed the experience. It was very fulfilling. And a few years ago, a position opened up at Cornell again as the Dean of the Faculty of Computing and Information Science. And so I took that position, and that's where I am today. So that's a little bit about me. And that's relevant because I'm going to give some personal examples of things as I go through. Okay, so I want to first talk about research. But not a whole lot, because this is something that you guys already know how to do. This is what you're trained to do. This is what we teach people in graduate school to do. We don't teach them how to do other things like teach or fundraise or whatever, But the tenure process is something that when I talk to junior faculty, everybody hates and is terrified by. So I thought it would be worth talking about that a little bit. Students, I think, are the most important component of your research career when you're in academia, and then talk a little bit about what I call a research portfolio. So tenure from a university standpoint is a very expensive investment. Just hiring you is a multi-million-dollar investment by the university. Keeping you for the rest of your life is a many tens of millions of dollars kind of bet, if you will. So there's a reason why the process is extremely rigorous and hard. At the bottom line, I mean, you can worry about lots of details, but the bottom line is what matters most is doing good research that impacts the world. And how can you tell, or how do departments tell? Primarily through the letters that they solicit from the outside world. So typically they write to senior colleagues in your area around the world, and they ask them Please tell us about this person's research, why she's so great, or what kind of impact she's had on the field. That's the kind of thing that departments really care about the most. I mean, you can talk about many other aspects of the tenure process, but that is the thing which, if you stare at it cold and hard, matters absolutely the most. So what do we try to read into those letters? One is, have you created, or do you kind of own a subfield in your discipline that others care about? So all those words matter. So for example, you may work on a field that you love, you think is fascinating, but the rest of the community thinks is boring for whatever reason. And unfortunately, it's going to be hard to get letters back that say, this is a great field that this person is working on. So that's one aspect of the challenge. And another is just that kind of ownership. One of the failure modes is to do little bits of interesting research in many different fields, but to not have a kind of common thread or theme that ties them together. So that's what I really mean by a subfield, if you will. Another thing that people are looking for is leadership in the scientific community. And by that, I mean thought leadership, that you're really driving the new intellectual ideas. And then one thing that we stress, in fact, there's a CRA white paper about this, is quality over quantity. That is just, looking at metrics like your H index or whatever, frankly, lazy letter writers use those kinds of metrics to try to reason about whether your impact is good. And lazy administrators use those kinds of things. What really ought to happen is you should have 3 or 4 great papers that you're willing to send to these letter writers to have them take the time to read carefully, and those should be the ones that really stand out for you. So quality matters a lot more than quantity, and I can't emphasize that enough, or it ought to, let me put it that way. Quantity still matters in a way because it's a rough assessment. People can sort of look at your CV and say, oh, he's doing a whole bunch of papers in the top conferences in his field, and that is somehow a high-level signal. But I've known brilliant people who've only published a handful of papers, but every single one of them was an enormous gem. And those are the people that universities are really looking for. If you can have that kind of impact, that's the thing to aim for. Another thing that junior faculty ask me a lot about is, well, should I publish alone or should I work with other people? It's really bad if we're somehow encouraging you to not work with other people. It's a community. It's great. Go out and work with not just students, but other faculty, not just at your institution, elsewhere. That's how the great research actually happens. Somehow in that world, you need to make sure that you stand apart. One of the issues that can arise is if all your papers and all your work is done jointly with somebody else, then a letter writer may be faced with the task of trying to evaluate what's your contribution in each one of these areas. So you need a mix, if you will, of things that you clearly own and drove, but also you should collaborate. And finally, you should be broad, but not too broad. Okay, so this is like the most useless advice in the world, because I'm just saying, do X, but don't do it too much. Do not X a little bit too. Okay. A good exercise that when I'm talking to junior faculty before they go up for tenure, that I highly recommend, is to draw up a list of names in your field and think about what they're going to say. You probably know them better than your department does. You've seen them at conferences, you've worked with them, you've seen their talks, you've read their papers, and you'll get a good feel for how things are going to turn out based on just sort of wandering through that list and thinking about it. Okay, so a little bit about tenure. Here's my tenure experience. I just assumed I was going to fail. Okay, when I got the job at Cornell, I shouldn't have gotten the job. That was lucky. So I just assumed I was going to fail. This is great. I had no pressure on me at all because I knew I was going to fail. So when you know you're going to fail, then you can do whatever you want to do. And I worked on research that I wanted to work on, and I published papers that I wanted to publish, and I didn't worry about the mechanics of tenure. There's a blog post by a former colleague of mine at Harvard, Radhika Nagpal, She calls it the 7-year postdoc. That she also sort of had that mindset that as an assistant professor, I'm just not going to make it. We all have this self-doubt. And it freed me to just think about the research and not worry about the tenure process. I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen, really? You're denied tenure, and you can go get a job in industry that pays you 3 times what you're getting paid in academia, right? I mean, if you think about it in other disciplines, it's a much bigger deal. It's important, though, to make sure your self-worth, the way that you evaluate yourself, is not caught up in this process, right? You have to figure out what you value, what you think is important. Do that. If it's not aligned with what the university wants, well, then you don't want to be at that university, right? I mean, you don't want to be in that position. So that was the mindset that I had, and I think that really helped. It also helped that I was lucky enough to find a hot new topic relatively early in my career, about the time my first child came along, and I wasn't sleeping. Actually, that was great. I stayed up all night carrying a baby around, and what do you know? I came up with some good ideas. So that's the lucky part. The not so lucky part, the making the luck, was I was really excited about it, and I evangelized to students. Okay, and when you're excited about your research, people can tell. And when students see that you're excited and you think this is going somewhere, then they want to work with you. And that's exactly what happened. I got some great students who started working with me, and the secret was I wasn't that good, but they were awesome. Okay, so these awesome students all of a sudden made the research really happen, and everything snowballed from there. Okay, so speaking of students, they're either a tremendous force multiplier for you or a force drain. And early in your career, it's incredibly hard to figure out how to work effectively with students. I was lucky, right, again. I had students that just sort of dropped into my lap that I worked with naturally, and we did some wonderful things together. Some things to watch out for, especially if you're a new professor in a new place. All the graduate students who haven't worked out with somebody else are going to come looking for you, okay? Because somehow, now, I don't want you to be too wary, because one of my best students, a guy named David Walker, who's a professor at Princeton now, was working with other people, didn't work out with them, and he came into my office. And I hadn't heard this piece of advice, so I worked with Dave, and now Dave is doing things much better than I am. So, nevertheless, I've seen that failure mode happen again and again, where a student that really doesn't figure it out how to do research or wants to do research wants to engage with every faculty member, and you need to be a little wary of them. You should go actively recruit students. The best way to get students is to really push hard. Even at places like Harvard or Cornell, where I feel like we get great applications, I really had to hustle to get good students. If you don't hustle, they're going to go to the places where people think the research is exciting or so forth. But what I've seen again and again is that it's possible to attract really top students to different places besides the MITs and the Stanfords and the Carnegie Mellons and so forth. It's possible to do that if you have a good enough research idea and you're energetic about it and you really want to drive it. But it takes a push. It takes a real push on your part. One thing that I found really hard early on was letting students really own a research project because my career depended upon it, right? So I really wanted to get in and write the code, right? They would write the code, I'd be, that's horrible. I'd throw it away and I'd rewrite the code. Or they would write the paper, I'd say, oh, that's horrible. I'd throw it away and I'd rewrite the paper. That's, first of all, a great way to discourage a student. It's also a great way to burn yourself out. And yet, they do need a lot of hands-on feeding and guidance. Graduate school is more an apprenticeship than anything else. And so working hand in hand with a graduate student is really important. But it's much better to take their writing and mark it up and then sit down with them and go over it so that they learn and make them rewrite it than it is to rewrite it yourself. And that's a hard thing to do because you're giving up control. And we tend to be type A personalities who want control. And we're really good at the things we do. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is figuring out what motivates graduate students. I wish I had a degree in psychotherapy or something, because every graduate student has required a different strategy to sort of extract the right productivity and behavior. Some of them way hands off. Just don't go near them. They'll come back to you with brilliant things. Those are the best students. That never happens, right? Many of them you need to have, certainly weekly meetings. If not, there was one student where we finally figured out I needed to meet with her every single morning. And we did a little scrum where we sort of caught up with each other. And it was because when she fell behind, she worried about disappointing me. And so she wouldn't come see me, and it would get worse and worse, and then I would get angry. And so what we finally realized was, if we met regularly, every single day, then she got over those fears, and I wasn't upset because I understood where she was or where she was stuck and helped her to get past it. And finally, make sure you have fun with your students. Okay, again, part of the reason you can attract really good students is if they think there's an environment there that is cool and nurturing and supportive. If you're just slave driving them, they're going to be miserable, and they're going to tell prospective students that they're miserable, and you're going to have a hard time attracting good students. Okay, my students, I mentioned, I'm incredibly lucky. I'm going to say this a million times. All my students have been smarter than me. That's the dirty secret, is you always want to get students that are smarter than you. It's not so much that they learn from you, but you get to learn from them. That's part of the reason the job is so amazing. There's so many topics that I would not have investigated, would not learn about. One of my students did a thesis on nominal logic. I didn't even know what nominal logic was when he started this, okay? And there are other examples of this, like I now know a little bit about machine learning because I had a student who was very interested in it. You end up being driven by the interests of your students, and smart students attract more smart students. So don't be scared of that. Embrace it. Go find really smart people and work with them. One thing that I found is hard is pushing too much to have a student work on a particular topic. And again, this is back to I wish I had that psychotherapy background so that I could figure out when to push and when to back off. But one of my brightest students, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania, she wanted to work on a topic that, I wanted her to work on topic X. Topic X was very applied. She wanted to work on topic Y. Topic Y was kind of theoretical and out there and so forth. And I thought, she'll never get a job if she does topic Y. But man, she wanted to do topic Y. And in the end, I just said, okay. And she went off and she did topic Y, and she hit it out of the park. And it turned out topic Y was very applicable and had a big impact. So Stephanie Wyrick is now one of the big leaders in her field. So finding when to push and when to back off is one of the challenges that I've had. Finally, not all students work out. Sometimes students really don't want to do research. I had one student who really thought, he wanted to be a software developer, a software engineer. He didn't really want to do research. And I'm not in software engineering anyway, so it wasn't really a match to try to push him towards software engineering research. But in the end, we figured out he really didn't want to do research at all. He left, started working for a company, and he wrote me back and said, I'm so happy now. And my only regret was that I hadn't sort of pushed him out the door faster so that he would be happier faster. That is, again, a very hard thing to try to evaluate. When is a student wanting to go through it? When do they just need that extra push from you to try to get over the hurdles and the humps that they have? That I wish I had a secret answer to. If you can figure out that it's not working with a student, it's hard to do, but the best thing you can do is cut it off early. Maybe they can find I had another student where it just wasn't working out. He went off and found another advisor who was awesome, and he's been very successful. I'm glad that happened. And again, my only regret is that I didn't help him along that path sooner rather than later. Research portfolio. Okay. So I've always thought it's good to have 2 or 3 projects going on at once, not just one. And part of this is kind of like investment, that you want to have a spread in your research to cover the ups and downs, right? So it may be that that theorem that you're trying to prove so desperately, maybe you get scooped on it by somebody else. If you have a couple other projects in the works, then you're not completely demoralized by the fact that your major research project has been scooped. I always try to have a mix of theory and systems projects. That is, things that are sort of more applied and things that are more out there. The things that are more out there tend to be the things that I really love, the things that I really want to work on. But the rest of the world may not care a whole lot about, I don't know, type theory, homotopy type theory, right? So, and yet I have conviction that 20 years from now it'll have a big impact, a big payout. So I try to temper that with a mix of projects that essentially pay for this. So, work on security in particular has been very fruitful in that context. Doing very applied things there has helped me to attract funding and students that have been able to apply not just to the system stuff, but also to the theory stuff. And then also, you often learn a whole lot more from the systems than you think you're going to learn. And often really good theory turns into something that's very applicable. So being able to bleed across it is really good. I always tell students the best PhD dissertations have both theorems and graphs in them. Okay, so eventually you're going to come to a point where a major research topic area that you've been working on, you're just sick of it. If you have to give another talk on that topic, you're going to throw up. Or you just, the excitement and the energy and so forth, the drive is just whittled away. So this, by the way, is a huge emotional low point in a researcher's career. When they come to the end of a research arc, I think of it more like mining. You found a rich vein of gold and you're chipping away at it and you get through the end, and then eventually you get to the point where the diminishing returns on that particular vein of research. So that can be demoralizing, and that's when you're off searching for other projects. And having 2 or 3 other projects in the background helps you get over those hard things. So I've been talking about research and the context for that. I want to talk about teaching for those of you in academia. How many of you are first-year assistant professors? Anybody? Yay. Okay, this is mostly for you guys. And the other people around here who are nth-year professors can tell you what I'm saying is true. First of all, you will spend all your time on teaching this year. It is an incredible amount of work, okay? Any time you're teaching a class for the first time, it's an incredible amount of work, all right? Or if you're rebooting a class and sort of remaking it over, it's a lot of work. So a couple of things. One is to make sure you amortize the cost of that startup. It's not as bad the second year, and it's even better the third year. Unfortunately, by the fourth year, you're kind of sick of it, and you think you ought to change it again, and so you have that startup cost because you throw it all away and you do it again. You want to amortize the costs. It's important to make sure that you talk to your department chair to make sure you're teaching the same class again and again so that you can amortize those costs. Otherwise, it's really hard. But in your first year, don't beat yourself up if all you get done is teaching, or it seems that all you're getting done is teaching. And finally, this is the hard one, I can't believe I'm getting up here as a dean and saying this, but you have to learn to live with a lack of perfection. And I will get to this in a second. You have to be efficient about how you use your time. And one of the things that we do is really over-prepare in anticipation of a classroom scenario, and I'll talk about that in my own context in a second. Okay, so my first class was an utter disaster. My second class was even worse, okay? And the worst part was these were graduate seminars in my field, okay? And they were horrible. I remember distinctly doing a proof on the board and a student raising his hand and saying, that's not well-founded, you can't do that. And I realized, oh, he's right. So I said, I'm sorry, I'll come back next time with a corrected proof. So I came back next time with a corrected proof, He raised his hand again. There's another bug. It took me 3 tries, right, to get that proof right. I didn't think I was getting any research done. I was spending all my time working on preparation for the classes. Fortunately, I had a really brilliant chair, Bob Constable, who recognized that I was floundering. And he did what I thought was the most counterintuitive but the most brilliant thing ever. He took me out of teaching classes in areas that I love and put me on an architecture class. Sorry, Mark. So I taught the architecture class to the double E's and CS students. I was a compiler guy, so I knew architecture. I could teach it, but I didn't feel like I owned it. And also architecture at the time, Patterson Hennessy had come out, and so I had this great book, and there was great projects. I didn't really have to think so much about what to teach and how to teach it, because there were great examples to follow. In contrast with the graduate seminars, these were in new areas that I was making up on the fly, and that's why I was spending all this time. There weren't books, there weren't resources, and so forth. So one of the things that ironically I learned is it's easier to teach something outside your field, because you're not as invested in it. Especially something that has good materials that you can steal from other institutions. So that's a good strategy for having a semester where you can focus on research without completely overwhelming yourself with teaching. Of course, later on when I taught the compilers class, I of course had to redo the entire compilers class and threw that away and spent an infinite amount of time on it. But I had learned my lesson. And one of the things that I learned was not to spend too much time preparing for lecture. This was somewhat ironic, but what I learned was I had a lecture on Tuesday, and I would start on Friday preparing the lecture. And then I would think, well, maybe a student will ask this question, so I better have some notes about that. Oh, maybe they'll ask that question. And I would spend all the time between Friday and Tuesday lecture just writing out tons and tons of notes. And then, of course, the students wouldn't ask those questions, and they would ask different questions that I hadn't thought of, and I would have wasted that entire time. So what I've learned since then is to make myself panic. Okay, so I don't start preparing for Tuesday's lecture until Monday. And then I'm in a big panic because, I gotta get it done. I focus, and somehow this time management skill has actually worked out for me. Is this true for anybody else? Yeah. Okay, so one of the things, ironically, I've learned, like this talk, I finished it this morning, right? Because I've learned not to prep too early. Another thing that I didn't do, and I wish I had, every one of your universities has a teaching resource center where there are people who know how to teach, and they can give you strategies and ideas for managing your course that actually make it much better. Somehow I came in with this haughty attitude that these groups would not be able to help me. Oh my gosh, these people are really smart. They're really good. They have great ideas. And furthermore, the way that, of course, teaching is being done is changing dramatically. As we move to more active learning approaches, as we flip classrooms, as we think about how to use online technology, it's changing dramatically. My generation has trouble with this. We like to do the lecture, in part because it feeds our ego, right? Just like I'm doing now. But the reality is that being effective as a teacher really requires some training, and you can get a lot of help from the teaching center on your campus, so seek them out. It also, by the way, I have seen tenure cases where people were struggling with teaching, and if they haven't gone to seek out help, that's a real sign that they're not cut out for the job. So, like I said, if at all you have any struggles there, they're a great resource and you should go track them down. Fundraising. Okay, so we've done research and teaching. That's half, let's see, that's 100%. Now we're moving on to the second 100% of your time. Fundraising. So writing proposals is very different than writing papers. Ken Berman, whose picture is there, gave me the best piece of advice I've ever had for writing a proposal. he said, sit down with a glass of scotch and then write your outline, okay? So the point is that when you're writing a paper, you're reporting out what you've done. When you're writing a proposal, you're dreaming of what you will do. And I will say that probably the biggest failure that we have as a community is we don't think big enough, that we don't think bold enough, that we propose small incremental changes. And yeah, that's part of that is to get past the reviewing and so forth. But if you want to go after and have really big impact, you want to think big. So if you can think big, great. An example is, who's here from NSF? How many people apply for the expeditions? So the expeditions is a program that gives you something like $10 million over, or $5 million over in years, or is it 10 million? It's 10 million. And so it's a big grant. Not that many people apply for it. And so the odds of getting it are actually surprisingly good compared to an NSF small. So it's something that you ought to be thinking about. Now, to do an expedition, you have to have big ideas. It's important to get in the practice of thinking big. One thing I always tell people is proposals are never wasted. So it's depressing how many times I've submitted a proposal to the NSF and it has been rejected. However, almost always I got useful, if obtuse, information from the reviewers that allowed me to revise that proposal and send it in either to NSF or somewhere else and get it funded. It never goes away. And the poor NSF staff know this because they see it again and again and again. But nevertheless, a proposal is never wasted. So, if you're thinking about, oh, maybe I shouldn't be writing a proposal this year, I'll have better ideas next year. No, just go ahead and write it this year. Do it. And then, okay, maybe it gets rejected and maybe you can refine and revise it next year. NSF will kill me for saying that, but nevertheless, it's true. A great thing to do to figure out how to get proposals past NSF is to go serve on NSF panels. How many of you have served on an NSF panel? Great. If you get an opportunity to do it, and if there will be people from NSF here today, you want to introduce, tomorrow, okay. You want to introduce yourselves to them. You want to get your name on their list so that they invite you. And part of that is when you see how these panels actually work, you realize how to write better proposals to get past the panels, okay? Ask senior colleagues for successful proposals so that you can stare at them. Team up. I was very fortunate that senior colleague Fred Schneider, when I came into Cornell, teamed up with me right away, and that allowed me to get some grants early on. Apply. Like I said, you don't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. I want to say something about broader impacts because that's the part of an NSF proposal that everybody kind of goes, what am I going to say here? A compelling broader impact statement is often, I've seen this again and again on panels, is often what makes a difference between otherwise technically strong proposals. And examples from your senior colleagues will help. But one of the things that I highly suggest is that you work with other colleagues in your department to develop programs that you can slot your grants into that take advantage of the whole departmental structure. Am I running out of time?
8 minutes if you want.
Oh, good. So an example of this is one of our faculty, Hakeem Weatherspoon, runs a summer program called Sonic, where we bring in researchers from underrepresented groups, actually undergraduate students from underrepresented groups who we introduce them to a week of research with the hope of thinking that maybe they'll apply to graduate school, and even more so, maybe to Cornell. We'll see. But that's an example where all the faculty can help participate, and it's something that they can propose as part of their broader impacts. Another thing to think about is diversifying your funding resources, or sources. So there are the usual government agencies. Something like 70% of CS is funded out of NSF. 81. Wow. Okay, which is worse than any other field, by the way. Other fields like chemistry, most of their funding are it's not 81%. So we're a little too reliant on NSF, and I'll warn you that NSF's budget has been flat and will be flat at best over the coming years, and yet every department that I know is hiring CS faculty. So you can do the math that the amount of money per researcher is just going to go down at NSF. So one of the reasons you need to diversify your funding portfolio is the chances of getting NSF funding are just going to go down. I'm sorry to say that. But there are many other great places to go after. One thing that I think our community isn't so good at is going after foundation funding. The Simons Foundation is a great example of a place that supports computer science research and is very excited about foundational questions, particularly theory. Industrial funding is something that CRA and CCC are focusing on right now. My favorite model for how somebody who's been very successful at setting up and running industrial research supported support from industrial research is David Patterson's lab. So he has this great facetious report, How to Build a Bad Research Center. And it's a great document to go read to see about how they successfully set up things like the Berkeley AMP lab to engage with the community. Okay, key thing though, you go after funding, yeah, you need the money to support graduate students, summer salary and so forth, but the real reason you do it is to have presence in the room. Okay, so that is, the real leaders of the field are the ones who are doing this. Mark mentioned Max Planck. So in Germany, you don't have to apply for funding. They just sort of give you piles of money. This sounds great. Actually, it kind of deadens the research atmosphere because people aren't in this competitive mode of going after and defining the field. They're just sort of sitting back and relaxing. So it's actually a good thing, and you ought to make sure that you're participating. All right, service, that's the last thing, okay. Research service, that's service to your community. So like reviewing papers for a journal or for a conference, maybe chairing, being a program chair for a workshop or a conference. Departmental service, so that's admissions committee or hiring committee or FUBAR committee. Community engagement, so in your local community, and this is, by the way, is increasingly important. Doing outreach and making sure that academia and research is well represented to the general populace. And then there's sort of national global service. So CRA and CCC are an example of that, also ACM and IEEE. There are also programs within the government that you should consider. So for example, DARPA has an advisory board called ISAT that's really good at doing visioning for DARPA. You could imagine someday serving as an NSF program manager. Those people are the most unsung and wonderful heroes of the world. They don't get paid much, but man, they really help to influence and impact where research goes in our community. As Mark mentioned, there are opportunities to visit government agencies like the State Department or the FTC and have a real impact there. So these are all examples of service that you'll have an opportunity to plug into, and I highly encourage you to do it. Now, early on in your career, the hardest thing is to just say no to as many things as you possibly can. One of my colleagues, Margot Seltzer, had a great solution for this. She gave me a stack of Post-it notes, and she wrote no on every single page. Every time I said no to something, I got to tear one off and hang it on the board. And that was a really good strategy because I had a tendency to say yes to too many things. I still do. It's a good strategy to say, would I do it today? Like if you're asked to review a paper, can I do it today? And if you say, no, I'm too busy, but I think I'll be free in 6 months, you won't be, right? You'll be too busy then too. So that's a good time to say no. A better strategy, by the way, especially with things like departmental service, is to proactively pick the things that you want to work on. Right, if you go volunteer to be on the admissions committee, even though it's a lot of work, maybe it's a great way to get students, but it's also a way for your department chair to say, oh, she's already doing work in that departmental service area, so I'm not going to tap her to do the toilet cleaning community or whatever, whatever that bad committee is. As you move forward, it'll be more important to take on service roles. And the reason I say that is that if you look around here, people like Greg and Susan and Mark, they've all blazed a path for you. They've really opened it up to make research an opportunity for you. And you owe them by helping the next generation, make it even easier. Also, the connections you build really help complement your research and your career. Okay, I want to close with work and home. This is the hardest thing. I'm not a good person to talk to about this. I'm really bad about it. I'm crying because my kids are going off to college, and I'm like, I missed it, all right? All I can say is that early habits stick with you. I wish I had started exercising from day one, for instance. One person did say something to me early on that really helped. I think it was Dexter Cozen. We were trying to decide whether to have kids or not, and having him pre-tenure seemed terrifying. And the most brilliant thing he said to me was, do you think you're going to have more energy and more time when you're older, or less? Oh, yeah. And that sort of gave us the courage to go ahead and have kids right away, and it turned out to be the best thing we ever did. It may not be kids, it may be something else, but don't put off the things that matter to you the most. You're not going to have more time later on. You're going to have less. Make sure that you carve out time for you. One of the things that I hear over and over again is people like to brag about how busy they are. Oh my God, I stayed up all night, I worked all weekend, I was in the office. There's sort of these informal battles, I get in earlier and I stay later than anybody else. These people are lying. They're not working that hard, okay? Relax a little bit. It's not so bad. Don't embrace this culture of overworking yourself. We're our own worst enemies. I mean, if you think about it, being a professor is essentially like having your own business. It's a franchise. You get to hang up the sign for your university, but otherwise you're responsible for everything, right? And that means you're responsible for managing your time, and that's probably the thing that we do the worst. Okay, so to just summarize, you got these things: research, teaching, fundraising, service, and then your home life, all to juggle. It's not easy, but it's still fun. So this is a picture of Uris Hartmanis. He's one of the real, leaders of the field. He just turned 90 a few weeks ago, and I had lunch with him. Uris, by the way, is the guy who wrote the original paper on computational complexity, right? So with Hartmanis and Stearns, if you haven't seen that, 1965. So Uris told me, early on, this is the best job in the world because you go through different stages in your career. He, for instance, in addition to being a brilliant researcher, was the department chair, so service in that sense. He later on was the head of SIZE at NSF, and he's raised a wonderful family. He's a wonderful guy. So he's the guy who was telling me, you have the opportunity to do all these different things as your career progresses. Find the one that's making you happy today. And that's what I would encourage you to do. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll get some questions, and that I won't be the only one that will field them. Thank you.
Okay, so even though we're at time, because software is slower, we'll take a few questions. If people are interested, please go to the mic and state your name and affiliation.
Or you can correct me, too.
Hey, I'm Lydia Chilton from this thing. It's definitely on if I lean over. Where am I from? Columbia, right. So you said to think bigger, and I wanted to maybe get some parameters on that space, because you can think so big that people think you are crazy.
Yep.
And there has to be some amount of people trusting or believing. Like, I've heard that you should have like half the work done already before you submit something, so that people don't, because I've seen proposals that I'm like, well, that's big, but that's crazy. So could you say some more about that?
Sure. I'll tell you the craziest thing that I ever got involved with. There was a project, it went on to win an NSF expedition, and it came out of a 12-year-old girl who went to her uncle, whose office was next to mine, and said, hey, bees are dying off. Can you build robots to replace them? And he said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So we formed a team of electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, computer scientists, and so forth, and wrote to the NSF to fund a project called RoboBees. And RoboBees were meant to deal with colony collapse disorder by allowing us to pollinate crops through little tiny flying micro insects. That's ridiculous. In fact, we got called out by Hannity as one of the top wasters of federal funding in that project. I was really proud of that.
I heard about that. Oh, you were proud of that. Oh.
I'm very proud of that. So, nevertheless, it was thinking big. Okay, now you're absolutely right. You have to do the real work to convince. So that was the very beginning of that project. We went and had seminars with bee experts. We read books. We did a lot of initial designs. We did a bunch of background, sort of back of the envelope calculations to try to figure out what was feasible, what wasn't, why we were going to head in this direction. So you're right. You have to do a lot of work, but early on, think big. We have a tendency to think incremental, and we also tend to have very local views that don't necessarily engage with a broader audience. The ones that really capture the nation's attention, those are the ones that are going to get big funding. And certain, and we'll hear about this with one of the panels, certain funding agencies like DARPA really encourage that kind of big out-of-the-box thinking. NSF tends to focus more on fundamental science. And so I think that's probably where you're hearing more of that advice directed towards.
And we're also going to talk more about this in the proposal writing breakout coming soon. Last question.
Hey, Stan Hawk, University of Rochester. So I enjoyed being on an NSF panel because you get to see the entire picture that you don't know as you're writing a proposal. So I'm going to put you on the spot as you serve as a department chair, now the dean. As you evaluate a tenure case, what are the priorities that are similar between a chair and a dean, and what are the things that could be different?
So a chair is making sure the trains are running, that people are assigned to classes, that tenure cases are actually being run by senior faculty and so forth. They do all the hard work. Deans have an easy job, frankly. We get all the money, and then we decide whether the department gets the money or not. So it's a very different world. But no, seriously, my job now is much more about fundraising and interfacing to the rest of the university, whereas I think a department chair is mostly focused on the care and feeding of the faculty and the students for that department. Does that answer your question?
Sure, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.